If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This episode is part of a series on the lies of productivity. When I say lie, I mean a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of what we're doing and how to best approach it. But these things are pushed at us so hard, and the challenges we face are so severe and growing that it feels like we're moving further and further away from what our situation actually should be. So I call them lies. In each of these episodes, I'll state a common belief about our work or our productivity, and then talk about the facts of why it just ain't so. A common quote attributed to Mark Twain, in error, probably, is, "It's not what you don't know that kills you, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So this series is an attempt to move through those misunderstandings. So once I've talked about what the common belief is, I'll talk about a more realistic mindset. And in most cases, practical steps to address the situation from that new mindset. So here we go. Let's start breaking down the lies. The lie I'm going to deal with in this episode is the notion that our productivity should be measured by a simple outputs divided by inputs equation. There are really several problems with that notion, and I'm going to outline them here, but just to give you a quick idea, one problem is that that notion was developed in the factory world, and the modern workplace has changed to the degree that we can't just blindly adopt that measure in order to get the answers that we need to get about our own productivity. I'll also discuss the notion of when knowledge workers use that equation, the typical input is time. So we say, okay, what is our output per unit time? And I'm going to argue that that's a really weak way to measure our inputs. We seem to be attacking the productivity problem the same way we attacked the efficiency problem in factories. And to be fair, that equation works very well in factories, and we have done a great job of improving factory productivity. And again, this definition of factory productivity is outputs divided by inputs. I'll also argue that there are differences in the nature of knowledge work versus the nature of factory work. We'll talk about that at some length, but the basic argument is that efficiency, which is some ratio of output to input, it's output divided by input, is not exactly the right way to think about knowledge work or productivity. So we'll get into it. The first claim I made is that the factory is a very different environment, and it probably doesn't apply to knowledge work directly. And we'll talk in some detail about those differences and how they impact our ability to cleanly measure our own productivity. I'll say the first difference between a factory and knowledge work is that a factory is a very repetitive place. A well-designed factory does the same thing over and over and over again. They make the same product over and over and over again. Factories hate changing product. They call it setup time, and it's generally considered to be a waste when you start thinking about how this machine needs to be reset in order to build a different part or to contribute to a different product. And that repetition is a key factor in the productivity of the factory model. That repetition allows for the creation of measurable processes in the factory. And the process is, well, we go over here, we make this part, and we go over here, we make that part, and then we come to a third place and we put those two parts together, and then we paint it, and it's very sequential and very logical and very orderly. For that reason, we can begin to define the process. The first time, even a physical product, the first time a physical product is made, it's rare that we're able to produce it right the first time out of the gate. I will say that computer modeling has helped us do this. But prior to computer modeling, people would have to consider and trial and error and think through how they were going to build the widget that would fit into the gizmo that would make the thing run. And there was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of manual creation of the different parts that were very rough when you put them together. Up until really probably the 1930s, most car production in the United States, most automobile production was hand done. Each automobile, each engine was built by a team of craftspeople. The repeatability and interchangeability of parts that is so much a piece of the value of factory production simply wasn't there. As we developed multiple iterations of building these products, we understood how best to build them. We saw sources of error. We saw sources of variation. We saw materials that didn't hold up the way we thought they would. We had opportunities to replace that and build things back in. Knowledge workers really don't do repetition. And I'll explain in great detail what I mean by that later in the episode. So the first difference between factory work and knowledge work is this repetition, this multiple times that a factory is built to do something, and all the research and development that goes into, once that process is stable, ways to improve it. The second primary difference is measurability. In physical product work, most inputs are measurable because most inputs are physical. Inputs are things like pounds of steel, things like number of bolts of this type and this cost. We struggle to do that in knowledge work because our inputs are very intangible. They're not physical. You can't count the number of thoughts that you had that lead up to your breakthrough thought. Factories have a huge advantage here, and it's part of that process work that they do, part of that repetition over and over again. But a big part of it is the fact that they're dealing in physical product, and thus there are pounds, there are counts, there are ounces, all these different measurements that they have, and they can put a pretty clean cost on that. When we look at measurability, another thing about factories is that quality is measurable. It's typically in a factory measured in terms of parts per million. It's measured in terms of testing batches of things. Less than 100% quality is often acceptable because the bad ones, if you think of screw manufacture, the bad ones will get thrown away and not used. And it's considered just to be a cost. Quality in the knowledge work world is very different, and I'll talk about that to some length here in a minute. So we take a clue about this measurability from factory work. And I know enough accounting and have looked into enough kind of Six Sigma kinds of processes and how do factories work. They really struggle to measure the knowledge work as an input. Knowledge work in the factory has to do with costs like the process engineer. How do we account for the cost of the process engineer? It's very difficult to say that that's a cost per product, although that's often the outcome. When we think about all of the knowledge work that goes in, the original product design, it's very difficult for accountants and our accounting models to attach that to the product as a clean cost. And you've heard the term overhead in accounting. And overhead is simply a big bucket of things that we don't know how to deal with. So we pile them all up and then smear them evenly across a given number of outputs. And so we account for that cost. But even in a place like a factory where things are very, very measurable, the knowledge work is handled very differently from the efficiency equation. Things like depreciation are handled well. Things like hard cost of raw materials are handled well. But when we start thinking about human brain work, it's not even in a measurable environment very well measured. And so that's a clue to us that perhaps these overall equations that we derive from the factory model might not be totally applicable in our work. A third thing about the factory model is factories have a really interesting relationship with the notion of time. Factories worry about time in very big chunks and in very small chunks. In intermediate chunks, they really don't worry about it a whole heck of a lot. Time is considered to be the process movement, and it's an outcome of the process rather than any sort of input to a measurement of the process. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because factories do try to right size, I'll say. They try to right size the amount of production time. And this is a pretty complex idea, but they do it. In Six Sigma, you manage the process time and you tune that up to equal the rate of customer demand. And what they're recognizing in Six Sigma is that producing too much product too fast, that is producing too many units before the market consumes those units, is a waste. It's a waste on two fronts. One is it's the use of raw materials, machine time, those sorts of things to produce a product that then sits in inventory. One form of waste of overproduction is that it consumes raw materials, it consumes factory time, et cetera, and then produces an item that sits in inventory. And inventory is not usually considered to be a good thing in the modern factory environment. Another interesting thing about time in a factory environment is factories can scale against time really easily, relatively speaking. So one of the things factory work considers is bottlenecks to the process. And a bottleneck is a single step that controls the overall output of the factory. And when factory engineers find bottlenecks, then they begin to think about whether they need to be expanded, and if so, how can they be expanded? And quite often it's fairly straightforward to expand the capacity of a bottleneck, which is just to buy another machine. Now, is it expensive? Maybe, but it's fairly simple to do. We think of this equation, this outputs over inputs in the knowledge work world, we think of it and we usually use time as the primary input. But that's really a stretch from the environment where the model was created and proven to be useful. So we'll take a look at that also as we go forward. If we now switch over and we look at knowledge work, how knowledge work actually works, then we find that there are big differences in how knowledge work outputs are produced as compared to how factory outputs are produced. But those differences aren't reflected when we just take their productivity equations and move them over to knowledge work. Those differences aren't reflected. I think we talked a little bit about knowledge work inputs are less tangible. When we talk about knowledge work inputs, we're talking about things like experience, learning, some capacity for creativity, for brainstorming. These things are almost completely intangible. They also don't have a clear cost. And so when we try to use this as an input, we can't do it. That's sort of an outgrowth or leads into another concern about knowledge work. The outputs of knowledge work are not manufactured in any typical sense of the term. What I mean by that is that the process is not well understood. When you go into a factory, it makes good sense. It's not hard to figure out that, there are big pieces and then there are subcomponents. And if we manufacture those subcomponents and assemble them in certain ways, then we get the product. In knowledge work, that's very difficult to do cleanly. In academia, we will use other people's thoughts and we'll refer to that in order to build our argument. So it's not that knowledge workers don't use building blocks. They do. But how to assemble them and how to acquire them and how many of them we have at our disposal versus how many we need is a very challenging problem. And so I just shorthand all of that into this notion that knowledge is not manufactured. The output of knowledge work is not a manufactured thing. As an example, we can think about problem solving. So problem solving is a core knowledge work outcome. A core knowledge work practice is we look at a problem and we apply our knowledge and then we produce a solution to the problem. But we don't know much about how that problem solving process works. I mean, even if we look at it from a psychology perspective, we don't know a lot about how our brains wrestle with problems and how the solution just sometimes presents itself as this flash of insight. It's not a stepwise process usually. It's a process with leaps in it. So we don't know a lot about how that process works. And this goes back to issues of measuring it and issues of figuring out what the inputs to it are. And there are several interesting things about problem solving that I think are instructive for us here. One is when we're doing problem solving, any solution to the problem is potentially a good result. It's a little bit difficult to rule out alternatives until we put them out in the world and test them. So when we're solving problems, we humans satisfy us. So we're willing to put up with suboptimal solutions to a problem, depending on what the cost of the problem is. And I'll talk about medicine as an example of problem solving. And what I mean by that is you have a certain set of symptoms and you go see a medical professional and your doctor will try to problem solve against your symptoms. That is, they will try to think through what the issue is and then come up with some sort of a solution to your problem. When they're doing diagnostic, in other words, when they're diagnosing, what they're actually doing is they're applying previous experience. You might even say they're reasoning by analogy in the sense that, well, if Larry comes in and he's talking about these symptoms, I had a case a month ago where somebody else was talking about similar symptoms. It turned out that the name for the condition was blah, and we treat that condition in these ways. And so diagnosis as problem solving is trying to fit experience into a current case and see if knowledge is reusable from a previous instance. When we look at knowledge work, even in medicine, we really never solve the same problem. We can have a solution that we refine, or we can come up with a completely new solution. But if there is a available solution, then the best thing we can do as knowledge workers is to utilize that previous solution and make it fit into the problem in some ways. This is why engineering often involves a lot of duct tape. It's because I got a thing that'll do what you want, but it doesn't exactly fit the hoogie what's it here. So we'll make a piece that fits in there and then it'll work for a while. One of the reasons that we don't want to solve the same problem twice is as knowledge workers, our solutions are very portable from one problem to the next. If I've written a paper on how to do task and attention management, I don't need to rewrite that paper in order to give it to somebody else. I just need to print out another version of the book, so to speak. That's because knowledge work, the output of knowledge work is information. And information works totally differently than any physical product. It doesn't have a physical reality, information. Sometimes it's encoded in physics, in physical products like printing in a book, but the knowledge itself is not diminished by being shared. So when we solve a problem, then we almost immediately go looking for other instances of that problem that we can apply our solution to. rather than, oh, well, let me create a unique thing for you that solves your problem in detail. So that has to do with the portability of the information, the reusability of information. This leads to the thought of knowledge work as constantly developing new knowledge, constantly developing new solutions to problems, constantly thinking through and coming up with new theorems, better explanations of phenomena that we see. That's a very academic definition of knowledge work. But we do develop new knowledge, and once we've developed that knowledge, then it's efficient for us to just reuse that knowledge in different situations as they go forward. So this leads to the idea that as knowledge workers, we really should never do the same task twice. We should never do the work to solve a problem that is already solved because of the portability of our solution. In the physical product world, we want to create more instances so more people can use a version of the product. I have a car, you have a car. And it's that physical reality that means the car company can get paid by handing you the solution that they handed me. Now we'll see that that's a little bit more challenging in the knowledge workspace because of this pure information problem. So one of the principles of knowledge work is to never do the same work twice, to go back to your previous solution. That has some cost that we'll see later, but is largely considered to be a core feature of knowledge work. The corollary to that is not only never do your work twice, but also never redo someone else's work. If there's a solution to somebody's problem that you're aware of, then typically we'll go find that solution and we'll apply it to the new problem. Knowledge workers are well known to beg and borrow, but not steal knowledge from other areas, from other spheres, from other people. And there are ways to borrow that knowledge. There are ways to pay for that knowledge and then apply it to the situation that we see, either directly or with some modification. Think carefully, if you're a knowledge worker, about the cost of solving the same problem 2 different times. That has implications on how we're going to organize knowledge work coming up. So then we look at, okay, well, we've got the factory idea doesn't exactly fit knowledge work for reasons that we talked about. Information portability, never doing the same task twice. There are other challenges to using time as an input to any productivity equation. In other words, we tend as knowledge workers to think, well, I can produce this many academic papers per year, per unit time. And when we look at productivity, we want to increase the number of papers or decrease the amount of time we spend to produce the same number of papers. So that's what I mean when time becomes an input. As we talked about a little bit, our ideas and our solutions, our output as knowledge workers are not manufactured. So it's very difficult to say with any precision, how much time did it take you to come up with this solution? Well, there's only 2 answers. One is, what was a flash of insight, so 0 time. And the other is, it's taken me my entire career to get enough knowledge to solve this problem. And both of those are imperfect measures. So using time in these ways is probably not a good idea from the get-go. Another concern is that, and this sort of goes back to the quality of what we talked about a minute ago, a better idea, a better solution is the result of trial and error. In other words, we take a solution, we imagine the solution, and we apply it to the problem, and we go, well, that works in these areas, but it fails in those areas. Let me go back to thinking about it and patch up those areas. Or we may bring in somebody else's idea to patch up that area. This trial and error process can take any amount of time. Again, it goes back to the quality idea, but to the degree that the problem needs to be perfectly solved, it can take a very large amount of time to get all those pieces moving together. And when we think about the trial and error way that we solve problems, and again, problem solving is this core knowledge work, I always think back to my geometry classes in high school, where we took theorems and we put multiple theorems together to constitute a proof of something. You may recall that there are certain things that are true about right triangles. And if you could find a right triangle as part of your problem, then you could apply these well-developed theorems to produce some solution. In this sense, this trial and error problem solving really feels like solving a jigsaw puzzle. It really feels like you get as far along as you can, and then you've got a specific smaller problem of a specific shape, and then you go looking for a theorem that kind of snaps in there and gets you the result that you are trying to get. Working like a jigsaw puzzle is a very interesting thought, a very interesting analogy to problem solving types of knowledge work. And I'll think about that more and hope to have more to say about it later. So I've talked about time, and as we use time as an input to our productivity equation, that has sort of a symbiotic, sort of a chicken and egg relationship to the notion of billing for our time as knowledge workers. And this is very interesting because, as we said, we can't really measure the time that it took to solve this problem. We can measure the time we spent thinking about the problem. And a lot of times we substitute that as a mechanism for acquiring some of the value of people using our solution. But billing for time is really an accommodation to the fact that these other things are not measurable. If you could say, well, I used 6 previous ideas and combined them to solve this problem, or to produce this new result, then all you have to do is add up the cost of producing those other 6 pieces of knowledge, and then add in an hour or 2 for cobbling them together and producing this new result. But we don't know how much it costs to produce the first 6. But notice how close that is to the model of cost and the model of efficiency that we use in the factory world. This engine is a combination of these parts. These parts cost X amount of dollars in total, and it took us 3 hours to assemble them. So that's the total cost of this new output. When we're reasoning by analogy in knowledge work back to a factory setting, we sometimes get caught in. There have been times when knowledge workers got paid by controlling the medium of delivery of information. And I'll give you an example and you'll completely understand what that complicated phrase means. When I say control the medium that contains the information, that means that we take the information which exists in our skulls and we transcribe it, we encode it in some physical medium. By that, I mean, we write our thoughts down on paper and then we sell the paper. That's what we call books, newspapers. We use recordings of our work, and those are on physical media, and we sell that physical media as a stand-in for the work that we've done. The record industry, when I was a kid, and then up through whatever it was, 2000, 2005, when music moved over into a more media-less representation, this caused havoc with the record companies, because a record company was built to take the information that is the musical performance, encode it on a vinyl disc multiple times, and then sell those copies as a way to get value back. That transmission by media, or transmission by medium, if you will, I never know how to use the plural here, but that transmission by ownership of the media is really being eroded by the internet and by the transmission of information that we see so readily around us all the time. So instead of encoding it as wiggles on a wax disc, right, which is what a record originally was, we encode it as bits, and we're able to move bits around so inexpensively that it's almost free to move the information. And so that's what I mean when I say the erosion of media as transmission. Think about electronic books versus physical books. The cost of distributing another copy of an electronic book is nearly zero, where the cost of producing and delivering a copy of a physical book is relatively large. So we're in this situation where we no longer make sense to try to control the medium. In other words, to sell the medium as a stand-in for another instance of our ideas. The medialess version actually conforms more closely to the understanding that we have of information, that information is largely free, that information is more valuable when more people have it. Information shown to someone produces value. If for no other reason, then they'll give you feedback on how to improve your information. So that erosion of medium of delivery is one of the things that can challenge knowledge workers and their ability to extract value, that is to get paid by producing their solution again. In fact, that was the actual source of the lawsuit against Napster years ago. The record companies had copyright on their media. Well, if that gets digitized and distributed digitally, then the need for people to purchase the medium went away. Why would I buy a record or run a record player when I've got a computer and a speaker that's hooked up to it and the bits fly around however they fly around, and then I hear music? I don't care if it's a record or if it's bits or what it is, as long as it sounds good. We're in this position now where we struggle to bill by controlling the medium of delivery of our information. Ideally, we would bill for our results. So the old Henry Ford story, the guy worked for Ford and he had retired and he was an expert on this machine, and the machine started breaking down or making noise or whatever it was. The engineers all looked at the machine. They couldn't figure out what was going on. So they called up this retired guy and said, "Hey, there's a problem with the machine." He showed up, took a look. He said, "Hand me a Phillips head screwdriver." And they did. And he reached over and he tightened a screw a couple of times and the noise went away. The machine's back to working like it should. But he went home and he sent, according to legend, he sent Henry Ford a bill for $10,000. And Henry Ford went, "You got to be kidding me. You were here for 10 minutes. How can you bill me $10,000? And the response was, "Well, it's $10 for turning the screw, $9,990 for knowing how to turn it and how tight to make it." That's an example of the fact that ideally, as knowledge workers, we would be able to bill for our results. We would be able to take a part of the value of solving this problem to our customer. We'd be able to take a part of that and share it. And it would be great if we could figure out how to do that better. And I think that's a way that we could go about this productivity issue, is to begin to invent ways that we can bill for the value delivered as compared to billing for our time. It's funny because lawyers will bill for solutions, and there's a twist to this. In legend, lawyers get in lots of trouble because they'll spend 10 minutes thinking about a legal issue and they'll bill those 10 minutes to more than one customer. And people get upset about this. Well, if they come up with a solution that applies to multiple situations and produces value in multiple different people's lives, then why wouldn't they be able to collect that value out of solving those discrete problems? And this kind of highlights our complex mental relationship between knowledge work and time. So to think about billing for time as a knowledge worker, lots of knowledge workers have found ways around this. Authors, musicians, developing these media. Now, that's not a solution that's going to be very useful going forward, but it may help us think about how to capture value from knowledge, which has a lot to do with productivity. Thinking further about productivity as a knowledge worker, we know from the factory example that being productive has a lot to do with avoiding waste. In factories, they work hard to identify areas of waste, and then they engineer to remove those processes that don't add value, these things that have cost, but don't actually impact the usability or quality of the output. Now, I'll go back to saying that one way to avoid waste is never doing the same task twice. That's pretty interesting because there are ways to handle this, and we'll get into some of those specific steps when we talk about tools later. If we want to improve our productivity, that requires knowledge that we can't produce with the current measures. I promised you that we would think about symptoms of not understanding the problem in the right way. Again, I argue that we don't understand knowledge worker productivity, so we grab up measures of productivity that are outside of our sphere to the point where they really don't work. So waste. What are areas of waste for knowledge workers? So we already said one, and that's doing the same work more than once. And we'll talk about how that can happen in a minute. Task switching is a waste for knowledge workers. And on record for this in other episodes, to the degree that we have a problem loaded up in our heads and we get interrupted, distracted, our focus shifts for whatever reason, that solution, that loading up of that problem disappears pretty quickly. If that disappears on us, then our only option is to reload it. And that can be a very expensive process. And it may not ever get us back to where we were. Oh, the solution was on the tip of my tongue and something happened and I lost it. Well, there's no guarantee that we're ever going to get back to that same place. But even if we are able to, it's going to take us a long time and a lot of effort to get back to that. So that's a waste, to be constantly task switching. That is a challenging thing to say in the culture of 2024, that task switching is a problem. We'll get into some detail on this in the remainder of this episode and then in other episodes as well. The second way that we have waste as knowledge workers, and this is going to be a challenging idea as well, we overproduce quality. Just take that in for a minute. We overproduce quality. Any quality that we produce that is not useful quality is waste. So let's take a medical example of quality. The ideal quality solution in medicine is a magic pill, a magic touch, something that instantly solves our problem, okay? Instantly makes our pain go away permanently, these kinds of ideas. Well, modern medicine doesn't really get very close to that ideal quality. When we look at medicine, let's take surgery for an example. It's very far from an ideal solution as measured by, hey, the shaman comes and lays their hand on your knee and you're instantly healed. Surgery is at best a uncomfortable workaround. Surgery involves the creation of a whole lot of pain for you short term so that you can avoid pain in the long term and avoid other bad outcomes in the long term, but we'll stick with pain. The doctor is going to hurt you so badly that in order to be able to pull this off, the doctor has to almost kill you. I've talked to some anesthesiologist types, and they always talk about how close can they bring their patients to death without actually killing them. And in some imagery, that's one of the things that they're trying to do, is they're trying to get us to the point where we're so far under that we don't react the way our bodies would normally react to pain. Anyway, surgery is, I'm going to cause you a lot of pain now to prevent some pain later. Now, we've developed a workaround for this problem, and that's anesthetic. So in order that we don't feel the pain, whether the pain is still happening or not is a philosophical question, but we don't have to deal with the pain because we're anesthetized, right? Novocaine. This workaround allows us to ignore most of the difference between what we would consider a perfect solution and what we would consider to be an acceptable solution. Now, sometimes we solve the problem at any cost, meaning that we'll put up with a lot if we have a life-threatening problem that will put up with a lot to do it. But short of that, I just want to recognize that medical solutions are far from perfect, but we still utilize them. And it's not just surgery, dentistry, for example. If it weren't for Novocaine, you'd think a lot differently about going to visit your dentist. You can imagine how much pain you'd have to be in order for the amount of pain the dentist would produce to be balanced out. But even in medicine, in drugs, we put up with lots of side effects potentially in order to get the good part of the medicine. And it's really interesting that we're willing to do that as compared to this perfect solution that we can imagine, but is not, of course, in the realm of reality, at least thus far. I will give props to the medicine people. I understand that the robot microsurgery is a great technique, and it took us a long, long time. All of us technologists, it took us a long, long time to get to the point where we could do that. I love you all out there, medical folks, but just using an illustration of the distance between an acceptable solution and a perfect solution. And I think we need to bring that in as knowledge workers, because overproducing quality is a waste. We're stuck a little bit because as knowledge workers, we struggle to measure quality on both ends. We struggle to measure the desired level of quality that our customer wants. And we also struggle to measure the level of quality that we've produced with our product. That's partially why I think we overproduce quality. Since we don't know, we want to do our best to exceed some minimum level of quality. And that is a waste. Producing higher quality than your customer desires is a waste. If you have manufacturing processes like Mercedes, but you sell at the price of Hondas, that's a waste and it will kill your business. So understanding your client and understanding the level of quality that they need, want, and are willing to pay for is really important. But in our world of intangible products, that quality is very difficult to measure. And there's another component of quality that really jumps up on us, I think. When we encode our information in a physical, tangible delivery mechanism, there's a difference between the quality of our information and the quality of its presentation. I think we get trapped in this a lot. And we have to realize that production quality is much less important than we probably think. So spending a lot of effort on production quality then can be considered a waste. In my world of producing this podcast, I don't have tons of production quality. Now, you can argue that it's cheaper, a given level of production quality is cheaper than it was 20 years ago, and I would agree with that. But even by modern standards, I haven't spent a whole bunch of time on production quality. That's one of the reasons I do an audio podcast as compared to some video podcast. So if we're not careful as knowledge workers, we overproduce quality. We overproduce the quality of the solution, and we overproduce the quality of delivery. And those can be considered waste. And when we look at efficiency, one of the first ways to gain efficiency, one of the first ways to gain productivity is to eliminate waste. So I think we can attack this a little more directly than previous ways of thinking about it. So as an efficient business person, I need to control the production quality and to give it the level at which you expect it, give it a level at which my thoughts are comprehensible. But if I were to take the time to render my thoughts in iambic pentameter, I think we would all consider that to be wasted effort. There's a third area of waste for knowledge work. So we said we never want to solve the same problem twice because of the portability and reusability of information. One of the challenges that we face as knowledge workers in this waste area is we know we've produced a solution that may be similar enough to use again, but then we have to go and refine that solution. Oh, I did this presentation a year ago, Where did I put that copy of that presentation? And this happens in at least three ways. The first way that we have waste is that we don't record our solution. As knowledge workers, we should record a lot of things. There's many ways to record it, but we should record it. Because if we don't, then we face another opportunity for this knowledge that we produced to be valuable to somebody. If we can't find our previous instantiation of that solution, then we're going to wind up having to recreate it from scratch. The idea being, well, I thought I had saved that PowerPoint presentation, but when I pull up the file, it's gone. So recording our solution. And then closely related to that is to have a record, but then to lose the record. Oh, it's in the file somewhere. And we wind up not finding it. So we wind up reproducing it. And these ideas are closely related. But losing the record of our previous solution does bring up an interesting point, which is that search time that we have to put in. Is that waste? And really thinking about how we organize our information so that we can find it again quickly in a minimal amount of effort and time. Thus, we can reuse it more effectively and more efficiently and avoid this kind of waste. Sometimes we don't record it. Sometimes we do record it, but lose it. Sometimes we know it's there, but we have to spend 20 minutes looking for it so that we can hand it to some new person. So those are some areas of waste. I would say if we're seeking greater productivity, then looking at these potential areas of waste and minimizing them are probably a really good way to think about it. It's a little bit divorced from the whole output over input thing, and it's somewhat divorced from my argument that time should not be the primary input. But that said, we can prepare to avoid waste in our search for greater productivity or greater efficiency, depending on your favorite word. I'll say that there are certain symptoms of not having good productivity measures, and we'll walk through what some of those symptoms are. I would say lacking understanding of the knowledge work process is probably a big one. So one symptom of not having good productivity measures and good productivity practices is that we multitask. And there are several ideas behind this notion of multitasking. One is we pursue urgency over importance. A new thing pops up in our world and we stop doing what we're doing and move our focus to the new thing. Well, that's as good an interruption as any. And our knowledge work that's going on in our skulls dissipates, if not completely disappearing. But our culture very much favors urgency over importance, and we can get into that mode almost by accident. Reason two, again, the cultural environment. Our cultural environment is such that we have fear of missing out. We think unknown information needs to be urgently acquired. We think all these things, and that's brought into our world through our culture and through seeing other people react and respond to these things. Reason three behind multitasking is we seek interruptions because we have a short attention span. And my evidence for this is the Lincoln-Douglas debates from 150 odd years ago. Lincoln and Douglas were both running for president, and they would travel around together in a train, and they would give their debate in different cities so that multiple people could hear what they had to say and think through which position they wanted to support with their vote. The interesting part about that is that those debates took all day. There would be an hour and a half worth of opening statements, 45 minutes on one side, 45 minutes to an hour on the other. And people would sit there and consume this information. My preacher has learned that his congregation's attention span is about 25 minutes as compared to this hours-long, logically complex argument that people were consuming and apparently doing it quite happily. So symptom one is multitasking, and there's at least three reasons to do that. And I think we can use better productivity measures to help us understand the cost of that. Another symptom of not understanding what's going on is we work too many hours. My evidence for the fact that we work too many hours, so people, if you ask high-powered CEOs, they'll say they're working 60 and 70 and 80 and more hours per week. Now, there's a little bit of humble brag going on there, so fine. And we're terrible at measuring how much of our time is actually productive. But my evidence is scientists have measured this with virtuoso artists. When I say virtuoso, that brings the musical idea into play, and they have looked at it with violinists and their practice routine. They've looked at it with chess players and their practice routine. What they find is that the practice routine, the learning routine, is best done in two-hour chunks per day. They'll do a 2-hour session in the morning. They'll take some time off. They'll do a 2-hour session in the afternoon. And apparently this has high correlation with retention of information and learning. Well, I don't know what the right number of hours per week is to work, but you've got these virtuosos working on their thing for 20 to 24 hours a week, and you've got these CEOs that are working 3 times that much. So there's a big gap there. Working too many hours is also a result of being overly concerned about the quality factor. Again, thinking about these things can help us get back to a good productivity measure. Along with multitasking, there's this symptom of moving tasks along. We touch things and we make them a little bit better in these 15-minute snatches. And then we put them back down, only to pick them back up 2 hours later and spend 15 more minutes against them. This is a very challenging way to produce quality knowledge work, because we're constantly, again, reloading the problem in our head. And that the more times we do that, the more often it's a wasted time. Another symptom is, and this kind of relates to urgency over importance, another symptom is our lack of clarity around the priority of the work that we need to do. We reprioritize quickly and perhaps for the wrong reasons. This reprioritization is part of a challenge of not having done this work in advance and not having recorded the work of our priorities. And you see this a lot in productivity training, is to sit down and figure out your priorities and stick to them. But the balance of reprioritizing versus sticking to planned priority, I would say, is something that we need to address. Another symptom is that we're deadline driven. Now, deadline driven is, in my mind, behavior that we're taught during school. And the notion is you can't overstudy for a test. May be true, may not be true, but there's definitely diminishing returns. And so when I say deadline driven, we work in these snatches as many opportunities as we have before the deadline, and then we stop. And this is related to moving tasks along. It's related to plate spinning. But it's really behavior that we learned in school because that was the only measure we had. Nobody would tell us, well, if you study 4 hours for this, you'll get a B. And if you study 5 hours for it, then you'll get an A. So nobody gave us the information that we needed. And fair enough, it may be that that information is simply not available. But nobody gave us the information that we needed in order to produce an amount of effort that produced the quality result that we wanted to get. So these symptoms are things that we sometimes all run into. And my argument is that if we can solve the productivity problem through analyzing how we measure productivity, then some of these symptoms would become more apparent in terms of cost, and that we'd be better able to address them. I promised you a different kind of a mindset, so I'll do that real quick. The different mindset is that time is not the number one input. Focus is the number one input. We must be able to utilize our focus and blend that into our productivity equation, because 30 minutes of focused effort almost definitely beats 2 hours of unfocused effort. In our equations, we need to promote focus to a number one position as it relates to our inputs on knowledge worker productivity. Results from changing the mindset will break the habits associated with the symptoms. We'll understand the cost better of those symptoms and more directly relate them to our productivity And then we'll actually see the cost, and that's something that will help us break out of these problems. Result 2 of this new mindset is we'll do what it takes to protect our focus. Many people in the modern economy and the modern culture don't take their focus, in my view, they don't take their focus seriously enough, and they let it get taken from them. They don't do what it takes to protect that focus. Result 3 is that we'll work to make our focus stronger. Just like many people go to gyms to make their bodies stronger, we'll work to make our focus stronger so that when we apply it, we get more value per unit of focus than we did previously. So these are some of the benefits of having this other mindset, and it relates back to how do we measure productivity as knowledge workers. Talk a little bit about tools for this new mindset. Tool number 1 is to get a timer and use it. Time box. Challenge yourself to produce a result in a smaller amount of effort, a smaller amount of time. So use a timer to do that, and that will increase and hone our focus. Another tool is more mindfulness practice. I argue that our focus is getting taken away from us from cultural factors, from our technology, from different areas like this. So thinking about mindfulness. And I think it's important that the easiest mindfulness tool that I can think of is sitting down and reading a book. And if you think of it, it really is a mindfulness practice, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to use the printed word on the page to create imagery in our minds so that we can follow the story. But it's also very good for practices that defend us against interruption. It's good for ways to extend the periods of time that we actually focus. Reading a book will help you, because how many times have your eyes have scanned over a couple of paragraphs, but your mind was somewhere else? And then you have to go back and reread those paragraphs in order to get the story into your head. More mindfulness, and the startup exercise is actually reading the books that are on your nightstand. A third tool is to manage a backlog of tasks. We can't do everything at once. We can only do one thing at a time. So we need to record the decision of the things that we're not doing at this time and make sure that those don't get lost, because otherwise the fear will attack us. I will say here that Attention Compass is developed to be a top-notch backlog management tool set. As we have these ideas, as we think of things to do, we have a place to put them so they'll quit bothering us, and then we can utilize our focus correctly, stay on task, continue our focus to effort, and be able to produce a result and deliver a result. A quick plug for Attention Compass. But the importance of the backlog is recording this decision to not do thing Y because we're doing thing X, but also to not lose track of thing Y. There's a couple of psychological tools I'll mention. It's a well-known fact that mindfulness practice leads to mindfulness improvement. The more you practice this thing, the better you get at it. And better at it is that you're able to snap into focus when you want to and stay there as long as you need to in order to complete your work and then deliver it. And that's really a backbone of productivity for knowledge workers. A psychological tool, I put this under the psychological heading, is more information. Are you gathering more information in your chosen area of knowledge work practice? Do you have devoted time to keep up with thought in your field? Are you still spending some time gathering new knowledge and keeping up with the state of knowledge in your field? A third psychological tool, and this is a big one, and I think I had a listener question about this, so I'll treat it as it deserves in a future episode, is confidence. We have to have confidence in what we're doing. We have to have the ability to say, I'm confident that this will solve your problem, that it's good enough to solve your problem. And then we have to have the confidence to deliver that. And there are some additional pieces here. I think it was the episode previous to this one where I talked about a book called The Confident Mind by Dr. Nate Zinsser. Very good book. I did not realize that you could take action to grow your confidence, but his book is very convincing on that front. So get the book and look for a future episode on confidence for knowledge workers and why that's important and how we can go about it. I'll do a quick recap. Our big question is, are we attempting to measure productivity in the right ways? I would argue that simply importing the productivity equations of the factory model are not those right ways. It forces us to focus inappropriately on time as the input when time is really not something that we can manage directly. We talked about differences between the factory world and the knowledge work world, and a lot of that boils down to the factory world is engineered and it's repeatable. And those two things work together to help us promote efficiency in a factory in ways that really at present can't be done in our knowledge work. We talked some about the differences from the knowledge work side of knowledge work versus factory work. In particular, we talked a lot about problem solving and how that process is not well understood. Maybe some more work on understanding how we go about solving problems would help us here. We talked about waste. One of the big deals about waste is we should never do the same task twice as a knowledge worker. If we've produced a solution, we should set up our environment such that that previous solution really jumps out at us when we face another instance of the same problem. We talked about ways to avoid waste. We identified areas of waste, areas like task switching, areas like overproducing quality, waste like refinding solutions that we didn't deal with appropriately the first time we developed them. The notion there is that step one in improving productivity is eliminating waste, identifying and eliminating waste. And so I gave some potential categories that waste might be happening in your process. We talked about some symptoms of not understanding this situation correctly. A lot of those symptoms are related to lack of focus. And I think that focus is the number one thing that we need to look at as knowledge workers. You can spend all the time you want, but if you're not focused, that time may well be wasted. We looked at a few different tools. Again, these are tools primarily to support our focus and help us understand how our own process works so that we can change the way we measure. Some psychological tools, I'll say the takeaways are probably more mindfulness, a task backlog, and this notion of confidence. And these are repeating themes that you'll hear in the podcast. Well, I blew through a huge subject very quickly, and I hope that I've been able to convey the ideas appropriately. I hope that you find this very useful in your own practice as you try to improve your productivity in your area of knowledge work. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.